need babies.
Radio Free Intimate, episode 304, talking about Eastern European black metal for the billionth time, but this time it's not Slavic, because we're going to be talking about a band from Romania, one of the most historically interesting parts of the world. In the same way that everybody likes to call the Finns Asian, a lot of people like to goof on Romania saying it's nothing but gypsies. Not actually true. The word Romanian actually comes from Roma, not Romani. So, Rome. And the reason they're called that is because despite being situated in the middle of a bunch of Slavs, they speak a Romance language. And the reason for that is pretty interesting. You see, way back when, the area known as modern-day Romania was primarily inhabited by a group of people called the Dacians in Latin, or the Dacians, as most people would call them now. They're probably most famous for their utilization of a weapon called the falx, which sort of just looks like a big old sword that curves outward. It's basically a scythe designed for cutting humans instead of grain, and it'll go right through your lorica segmentata.
You heard right. Nasty weapon.
Really not something you want to be on the business end of, but that's just where the Romans found themselves when they invaded not once, but back in 100 AD. And eventually, the province of Dacia was Romanized. Later on in the Aurelian retreat of the 280s AD, the Romans pulled out, but the Dacians still had a lot of Roman culture. And so later on, you got all these Slavs and Germanic types and Celts running around. There's this group of people in the Northern Balkans speaking essentially a descendant of the Latin language, and that's the Romanians. So they've got that long-ass history. They got all the influences from Scythians and Slavs and Goths and whatnot. Plus, this is where Transylvania's at, so it's got that whole
so hard they thought I was a fucking nutsack. Shit ain't nothing to me, man. I'll kill you, you stupid piece of shit.
Dracula thing going on. You'd expect these guys to probably be capable of making some pretty interesting black metal. And that's what the band we're talking about this week did way back in the 90s and early 2000s. Negură Bunget, which means dark foggy forest in Romanian. They originally put out a demo in 1995 under the name Wiccan Red, entitled From Transylvanian Forests, and that seems a good place to start as any, so let's go!
We'll do it live! Fuck it!
Despite being, a demo, From Transylvanian Forests is pretty darn professional sounding. Really dig that guitar sound and the very watery keyboards. It's still very cold and black metal, but it's less freezing and more sort of damp, humid, dank, which fits their foresty atmosphere that they're shooting for. I hear quite a bit of early, Stormblast era Dimmu Borgir going on here, both in the very catchy nature of the guitar riffs, but also, particularly once the keyboards kick in. The atmosphere is very dark and mysterious, but not necessarily evil or blasphemous. Certainly quite vampiric, though, particularly with those very hissy sort of vocals. The future Negură Bunget trademarks of very dense guitar arrangements and much more technically proficient than is normal for the genre level of drumming are already in effect, even if they're not quite as pronounced as they would become later on. And their songwriting already shows a predilection towards epic narratives, such as right here when they bring back that atmospheric riff from the beginning of the song, now with a much more slower and more stately drum beat under it instead of the double bass that they started the song out with. Overall, it's an excellent demo, and if all they'd ever put out was this demo, they'd still be kind of a cult classic, sort of under-recognized band. Luckily for us, they kept going. And they changed their name from Wiccan Red to Negură Bunget proper, and put out their first full-length album a year later, Zîrnusa, or Nightshade. And it continued much in the tradition of what they were doing back in the Wiccan Red days. In fact, quite a few of the songs in the album are actually reimaginations of Wiccan Red era songs, like the one you're listening to right now. The main update being in aesthetics and texture. The drum arrangements are a whole lot busier. The guitars are much more densely produced, resembling Hate Force Sorrow album a lot, actually. And with that much denser sound comes opportunities for more aesthetic dynamism, because when they calm down with the double bass and the keyboards, it becomes much more noticeable. And when they jump all those elements back in, it becomes much more impactful. Again, the vibe is very similar to Dimmu Borgir's Stormblast album, which I will never complain about because it worked really well there, and it works possibly even better here. And though it doesn't tread into the avant-garde realms of their later work, there are some wackier elements. Like these occasional digressions into more death metal vocals, and that really weird tom work the drummer's doing. Also, I really dig this sort of tremolo pick lead guitar overlay right here. That sort of thing would become very important for later Negură Bunget. Overall, Zîrnusa, great album, but really does feel more like a Wiccan Red full length than the Negură Bunget most people are probably more familiar with today. That sort of really weird, kind of out there, avant-garde, post-whatever black metal type stuff doesn't really start to show up until the follow-up EP, Salusa. This is where they start to get
a little cuckoo, a little wacky.
It's also the first album with what has become known as the classic Negură Bunget lineup, with Negru, who'd been in the band since the beginning, handling all the percussion, and then the two guitarists, Soulflower and Hippopotamus.
Do you know what that is? That's the sound of the Snuffleupagus. He's here.
Hippopotamus.
Yeah, that. Also, they ditched most of the vampiric affectations of their earlier work in favor of a more authentic, sort of folkish approach. Like, I probably couldn't pronounce any of the names of the instruments that are being utilized here, but they're certainly rather unique sounding. This 8-minute monster that opens up the album also shows off how much more deeply they've started experimenting with ambiance. In this sort of droning ambient black metal where everything sort of emanates from a singular point and expands outwards in a very repetitive manner, with a whole lot of different layers, would become one of the most important elements of their sound going forward. Like, they ride this groove for pretty much the first 2 minutes of the song exclusively, and then when it finally does change up, that gives said change up more impact. For some people, it might seem a little bit too repetitive and droning, but I think the quality of those riffs themselves is high enough to maintain listener interest, and it's cool seeing them shift layers around. Like when they go back into that droning riff from earlier right here, they've added a second guitar layer that's sort of performing a counterpoint, and then this really cool kind of keyboard line bouncing off of everything, as well as some music concrete found sound stuff with the fire noises. And much like Ancient, back when they were a good band, they end the song with a very nicely done blasting coda. Other songs on this EP are a little bit more riff-based and busier sounding, and they are also quite good. For instance, the combo of this sort of recursive inverted riff with those timpanis really makes me think of Master's Hammer, and that's always a good thing. And the drumming during the more blast beaty parts is fantastic. I love his utilization of different cymbals and the sort of loose feel the double bass has to it, very rolling. Also, a lot of their riffage is quite a bit more aggressive than their earlier work, and yet it incorporates a lot of folky elements, like this flute bit right here, which actually manages to gel with that more aggressive sound. They also really take advantage of the fact they're utilizing two separate guitar players, so you have these weird interlocking dissonant chords, kind of multiple droning guitar layers playing off of each other in a way that would be clashing but actually kind of ties together very nicely. And when it does jump back into standard black metal, it's that much more impactful, because it has that folky weirdness and dissonance to contrast with. Their second full-length album, released 2 years later, Maestro Svetnik, picks up the Salusa style and runs with it. But we're not going to talk about that right now.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
Don't worry, we'll get back to that one eventually.
I had my orders from the Emperor himself. He has something special planned for me.
Right now we're going to talk about another concurrent project that existed during the very early years of Negură Bunget, back when they were still called Wiccan Red, that being the odd sort of avant-garde doom death band called Macromia, which featured all three Negură Bunget members. This stuff was only ever issued on cassette, and to my knowledge was never officially re-released, which is a damn shame because it's pretty cool stuff. A whole lot of rhythmic screwiness going on with this band, even more so than some Negură Bunget stuff. They're kind of forgotten nowadays, but I feel like this other project's fingerprints are all over what I would like to call the third era of Negură Bunget, which runs from about 2002 to say 2009-ish, where they really started experimenting with incorporating a whole lot more palm muting and percussive riffage into their sound, as well as even more ambient stuff. Perhaps the most concise distillation of this style of Negură Bunget is on their 2005 EP, Inarborat Cosmos. What's cool about this era of Negură Bunget is the non-black metal portions of the music are honestly just about as interesting as the black metal parts. Like, yes, it's ambient and weird and folky and kind of world music-y, but it also has this really deep, mysterious sound to it, and it's quite a bit busier than this variety of ambient music usually is. Most black metal bands don't prominently feature percussion during ambient portions like this, but Negură Bunget does. It adds an element of dynamic tension that really makes the black metal elements pop out. And there's the Macromia element, because check out how percussive the right channel guitar is. Almost kind of death metalish, and it really does an interesting thing where it ties in with the more black metal style full chord guitar in the left channel. And they do this cool thing where they kind of knit together into more of a standard black metal phrase. This particular song, Wordless Knowledge, is actually what sold me on Negură Bunget back in the day, because I saw the post-black metal label, I saw all the real hipstery people talking about them, I figured this ain't gonna be a band that I like, but I happened to check this EP out, and I'm like, damn, this band kicks ass.
Rock and roll, motherfucker!
They ended up remaking this particular song on their fourth album in a pretty faithful adaptation. In fact, the only thing they really changed was less synths and more folk instrumentation during the intro. We aren't ready to talk about that fourth album yet, because part of what generated so much hype for that fourth and most famous album of theirs was how much of a titanic shift their sound underwent on their third album, Negură Bradul, which only featured 4 songs, each around 15 minutes, true Burzum-style stuff. And yet at the same time, a lot of this album was even more like riff-based than their early material. It also still features plenty of that sort of flowing melodic black metal that they were always really good at, which probably helped bridge listeners into this new era of Negură Bunget, because they also got plenty of parts where they jump into that more percussive, weirder style. I mean, you got one guitar doing chugs, the other one doing some weird dissonant shit.
I like this one. One dog goes one way and the other dog goes the other way.
Then they go back into the more black metal part, jumping between the two styles. Also, check out this crazy fucking double bass here. What is this, Flo Mounier, Frost, Hellhammer? Nah, it's just Negu from frickin' Negură Bunget kicking ass. Speaking of which, when that percussive part comes back around this second time, it gets even stranger. One guitar doing this like crazy post-metal kind of thing, other guitar chugging, but then the black metal guitar starts getting way more choppy with its own musical phrases. Drums are doing all kinds of weird triplet beats to link everything together and lock in with the guitars. Then the left channel guitar starts getting a little bit more normal black metal-y, but still weird and dissonant. Right channel guitar is doing these kind of percussive accents bouncing off of that black metal guitar, before then also contributing its own sort of droning tremolo-picked melody, weaving together these two very disparate melodic threads. Downright progressive rock sounding, kind of technical black metal or something. Whatever it is, it's cool as shit. Back in the day, before those type nerds came along, bands like Negură Bunget, Arcturus, Flurity, Doldheimsgard, that kind of thing, this is what was considered post-black metal, because it was black metal trying to evolve as a genre while still staying true to its roots. And this post-black metal thing really applies to their fourth and most famous album, simply entitled Om, which is kind of like a wacky double entendre thing, because Om is the Romanian word for man, you know, like a person, but it's also, you know, that Hindu thing, and the combination of those two concepts really fits with this sort of weird Transylvanian spirituality pantheism thing they had going on around the time of this release. More importantly than kind of having a cool concept though, this album is really, really, really good. One of the few really big kind of mid to late 2000s critical darling.
It's the most important black metal album since Dave Mysterious Dom Satranis. Finally, black metal is moving forward into the future. This album cured my depression.
I'm gay! Type releases that actually lives up to its own hype. You got plenty of that awesome sort of sheets of sound, Streed style, washes of depressive black metal noise. But over that, they drop these amazing guitar melodies. Like this one right here gets stuck in my head all the fucking time. It's a real long, winding sort of melody, but it's a real catchy one too. And it leads into more of those post-black metal elements. Like this surprisingly light on the guitar distortion, sort of tremolo-picked, overlaid lead melodic guitar line, which then transitions very effortlessly into this album's version of those weird percussive phrases that are actually a little bit less weird sounding this time around. They're not quite as gotcha, bitch, with the strangeness. Instead, this album flows very smoothly, despite all of the weird elements. Like this cool little hammer-on pull-off thing they're doing here. We transition into much darker territories. Because yeah, it's post-black metal, but it's still fucking black metal. And that means they're gonna hit you with the darkest and most evil sounding music of their career when they feel like really getting into it. Pretty harrowing stuff. And then it jumps into the more kind of post-black metal ambient type thing. with those long drawn-out notes in a case where modern style production actually helps the album out a lot. And eventually they come back around to that awesome, droning, depressive riff from the intro. Only this time they've added an extra synth line layer to it that gives everything a real sense of finality. They even bring back that melody I love so much.
And we like that.
Om's a pretty darn fantastic album, and Negură Bunget were kind of on top of the black metal world after it came out. Unfortunately, Hupogramos and Soulflower decided they didn't really get along with Negru anymore, so they left. They started up a new band, kind of the Negură Bunget style, called Dordedu. That was, it was alright. Not as good as Negură Bunget. Speaking of which, Negru kept Negură Bunget going with a bunch of albums that weren't as good as the old Negură Bunget stuff before he passed away in 2017. Kind of a sad end to the band. But do you remember, earlier on I said we were going to get back to what they were doing with that second album?
That's what made you did.
I lied.
Just kidding, I actually didn't lie to you. Because the final effort put forth by the unholy trinity of Hupogramos, Soulflower, and Negru was a re-recording of that second album. Because they weren't really pleased with how that album came out the first time around, they decided to redo the whole thing, but incorporate all of these new aesthetic innovations from the latter part of Negură Bunget's career. And let me tell you, this re-recording might even be better than Om. Hell of a way to go out. And it's not like, the original version of the album was bad or anything. It's got your Negură Bunget riffs come in like...
But man, that ain't nothing compared to the rush you can get when you're
doing stuff like this. What a fucking riff, bro. That is some proper evil black metal type stuff. But it's got that wacky new style Negru drum. And they bring in those new atmospheric elements. Like that crazy whistling noise was in the original version of the song, but it just sounds so much beefier with this big old synth backing they've given it, and that really human, modern-day Negură Bunget style guitar production. They also utilize some of those wacky percussive style musical phrases, those oppressive, hanging, palm-muted, chugged-out chords, building up into a really weird sort of atmospheric kind of segue. Those echoing sort of post-black metal style riffs. Sawing, sort of echoing guitar distortion, leading into one of the coolest lead breaks they've ever done. Really nicely done tremolo guitar picked melody, and from there they jump into some more like almost early campfire style sawing chords before really kicking it up into high gear with absolute symphonic black metal madness. Real sicko outfit, and that continues. The percussive riffs come back, and they're doing this weird fucking solo over everything. It's the best of older Negură Bunget and third era Negură Bunget all coming together. This 2010 version of Maya Street might be my most listened to album from them. It's at least tied with Om, which as we've already established is a masterpiece. Salusa EP, highly underrated, also amazing. Pretty much all of that 1995 to like 2010-ish run for Negură Bunget is essential listening if you want to hear modern black metal that's actually good, that is. But even if you're not into that, thanks for listening or watching whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.